Hi, welcome to StormGeo's video on demand spring weather presentation. I was going to say weather webinar presentation, Fred, but we're not doing webinars anymore. We're providing the same content, but we're doing it from right here in the StormGeo studio. And we kind of have a treat for us today because it's not all you. All you is great when you do your presentations, but we're actually going to provide a little bit of time to Chris Hebert, our lead hurricane forecaster, to do his presentation. He recorded just yesterday or the day before the spring outlook for the 2017 Atlantic hurricane season. So your presentation starting right now is severe weather and the global patterns that are responsible for that. We'll follow it up with Chris.
Very good.
So Fred, go ahead.
Absolutely. Let's go ahead and take a look at the presentation right now. Typically for these global patterns that David was talking about here, I look at these water temperature anomalies, particularly across the Pacific Ocean, since that's where most of our weather comes across the United States this time of the year. And let's go ahead and take a look at this map right here, and you can see some of the key areas that I like to follow. Starting all the way west into the Indian Ocean, if you can believe it, that area actually has a big impact on the development of El Nino. Typically when we start to see colder water develop there, that's an indication we may see an El Nino try to develop right across that area, and that's the tropical Pacific. And you see that yellow and orange shading there starting to show up. That's an indication of some warming water and possibly the development of a weak El Nino as we go through the spring season. Also very important up to the north, notice that blue shading. That's colder than normal water shaping up across the Gulf of Alaska and then west of California. That's part of the reason why they've had so much spring weather in regards to snow and heavy rainfall across the Pacific Northwest, all the way actually going back to the winter. And that is actually spreading into the plains as well. But you can see typically when we have that colder water, we wind up with lower pressure there, higher pressure across the United States, and then that storm track there plowing into the west coast, and then also provides fuel for severe thunderstorms across the central and eastern United States. Also across the tropical Atlantic, right now it's cooler than normal. Chris will have more on that in just a moment, but right now that's a negative factor maybe for tropical development as we go through the Atlantic season. I also like to look at this map. This is the water temperature changes over the past 3 months across the Pacific Ocean. Notice across the tropical Pacific, we're seeing warmer than normal water. That's an indication of that El Nino, but colder than normal water shaping up right across the west coast. Also, that is a very important indicator to follow in regards to the long-range weather pattern. A lot of people don't look at this, but this is right now soil moisture. Anywhere you see that yellow and orange and red shading, that represents drier than normal soil. And that heats up faster during the spring and summer months, and typically you wind up with higher pressure across that area. So that could be a block for the development of thunderstorms across that area, or a negative trend for that area. Also, where you have that green shading, that represents higher than normal soil moisture, and you typically get lower pressure that develops under that. And so in between the high and low, that counterclockwise circulation around the low and clockwise around the high, you get that moisture surge right up the plains, and that's typically where we've been seeing some enhanced severe thunderstorms during the spring season. Also, this could be a precursor. If we do see early season tropical development, then we could wind up with some tropical tracks right up towards the Texas coast. So that's something we'll definitely be monitoring as we go through the spring and early summer months. This is another graph I like to look at. This shows the temperature, or actually the pressure configuration we've seen over the past month across the United States over towards the Northeast Pacific. Anywhere you see that blue shading, that represents lower than normal pressure, and that's right underneath where that colder than normal water is. And anywhere you see the yellow and red shading, that's higher than normal pressure. So our average storm track, you can see that from Northern California up into southwestern Canada. That's where we've seen enhanced precipitation across those areas over the past month. And then even dipping down across eastern Canada, that's where we've had some unsettled colder weather across that region of Canada. But generally what that means across the United States, you can see our temperature map there on the left. There's been a warm bias, temperatures as much as 6 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit above normal over the past month, and that's due to that very strong southerly wind flow into the plains from the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific Ocean. And on the right side, you can see also that moisture plume providing plenty of precipitation from Texas over towards the Great Lakes, and then look at Northern California over towards the Pacific Northwest. Above normal rain and snow across that area associated again with that very active Pacific storm track. The southern United States, that brown shading represents drier than normal soil, and that's pretty much where that higher than normal pressure area has been setting up so far during the spring season. Another graph I'd like to look at, this is so far the total tornadoes we've seen so far during the season. You see that black line, it represents the normal. The red line represents the actual, and you can see we're well above normal, maybe 150 to 200 tornadoes above normal so far this time during April compared to a normal season. And on the right side, that represents our wind reports as far as severe wind reports. And you can see we're also averaging well above normal. That blue line represents, counts as well above normal based on the normal trend, which is that black line on that right-hand graphic. And as far as our El Nino projections, this, of course, is a very important index to watch as we go through time. You can see on the left-hand panel there, most of those models are indicating pressure or make that temperature anomalies as much as 0.8 degrees centigrade higher above normal. Recall that 0.5 degrees centigrade or higher is considered a El Nino, and anything above that is considered a stronger type El Nino. And you can see on the right-hand graphic, these are water temperature anomaly trends as we go through time. And this particular model is showing weaker type El Nino conditions as we go through time. You can see for May, June, and July, the average is, it looks like about 0.8 to 0.7 degrees centigrade above normal. And so this is the general trend. We're favoring a weak El Nino as we go through the spring season and possibly a stronger one during the summer. But right now, I think it's going to be a weak El Nino, possibly a weak to moderate El Nino as we go through the summer, particularly August and September, very critical time period for deciphering tropical development. Typically during a developing El Nino, we have warmer than normal temperatures during the spring across the deep south and eastern United States and across most of the Rockies. But notice the plains over towards the Dakotas down to Texas typically have near to slightly below normal temperatures. And on that right-hand graphic, notice during El Ninos, we typically have wetter than normal conditions across the plains, Rockies, and across a large part of the deep south with drier pockets across portions of the west. Here's our temperature outlook over the next 5 days. You can see warmer than normal temperatures across most of the eastern United States, southern Rockies, and look at most of Canada, and then down through the plains, we're showing somewhat of a cool temperature bias. You can see the temperature legend there in the lower right as far as our temperature anomalies. As far as precipitation, anywhere you see that green shading, that's wetter than normal conditions. And you can see that from the northern Rockies over towards the northern deep south. And then drier conditions across the Gulf Coast into the southern Rockies. You can see on this graphic we have a winter storm risk from the southern Rockies, make that southern portions of Canada down into the northern U.S. Rockies. We have a high wind risk across the Great Plains of the United States. And look at those severe thunderstorms, elevated risk for severe storms from the central plains into the deep south and maybe as far north as the southern Great Lakes during this time frame. And on our storm watch threat identification, we do have that severe thunderstorm risk that's centered for today from the Red River Valley over towards the Great Lakes. Then as we go through April 20 to 22, we have a heavy rain risk from northern Oklahoma into southern Missouri. This is where we could see an elevated risk for some flash flooding. And then a high wind risk from the southern plains or the Texas Panhandle region over towards southeastern areas of Colorado. Very gusty winds through April 21st through the 22nd. And then last but not least, actually we have two more panels here. Another severe thunderstorm risk from north central Texas over towards southern Missouri through April the 22nd. And then another one from southern Louisiana over towards central Tennessee. That is as we get also into over the next 4 to 5 days with a cold front sweeping across that area. And let's go to days 6 through 10 through the 29th of April. Notice those warmer than normal temperatures start to take a foothold, spreading again northward or towards the Great Lakes, covering most of the south central and eastern United States, a cold temperature bias from the northern U.S. Rockies into central and eastern Canada. As far as our precipitation, look at the plains over towards the northern Rockies and Great Lakes into eastern Canada. Higher than normal precipitation across that area. Still have a dry bias across the southeastern United States over towards the mid-Atlantic and across portions of central Canada. As far as our severe thunderstorm risk, you can see that from the Great Plains over towards the southern and eastern United States, particularly from Texas over towards Nebraska and points eastward. We do have that high wind risk from the southern Rockies into the Great Plains of the United States. And again, we're holding on to that winter storm risk across southern Canada down into the northern U.S. Rockies. And let's go out to days 11 through 15. This will take us through the 4th of May. You can see the eastern and southern United States above normal temperatures as represented by that red shading, and also across much of western Canada, and colder than normal temperatures across the northern U.S. Rockies and Plains over towards central and eastern Canada as represented by that blue shading again. As far as our precipitation, again, above normal precipitation across most of southern Canada, represented by the green shading, then right down towards the southern plains and the Mississippi Valley. And notice that severe thunderstorm and heavy rain risk from Texas to Nebraska, and then eastward towards the mid-Atlantic. Very concerned about some enhanced severe thunderstorms during this time frame. Again, holding on to that high wind risk across the Great Plains into the eastern U.S. Rockies, and that winter storm risk across southern Canada into the higher elevations of the northern Rockies. Still holding on to a dry bias across the eastern United States over towards the Maritimes area of southeast Canada, and from northern California into the British Columbia area, southwest British Columbia. Let's take a look at the extended forecast. This is going to take us through June and July. And notice we're holding on to a warm temperature bias across most of Canada. That's been kind of a switch to what we've seen over the past 2 to 3 weeks. We're going to be, looks like, seeing warmer than normal temperatures really setting up across this area during the spring into the early summer season, and then down into the eastern United States. Notice the plains over towards the Rockies, though, we have near normal temperatures across that area. As far as our precipitation, above normal precipitation from British Columbia down through the central and southern plains, a dry bias across southeast Canada down towards the Tennessee Valley. And this is the area where we really have to watch for enhanced risk for severe storms and heavy rainfall, again from the plains over towards the mid and lower Mississippi Valley. And when is the average time for severe weather probability through July? Well, typically in April, it's centered right across the southern plains into the deep south. But notice during May, that starts to spread northward up towards the plains and towards the Great Lakes. And particularly by June, it's centered across the Central Plains, Ohio Valley, and Great Lakes. And by July, it's across the Northern Plains, Ohio Valley, Great Lakes, then even over towards southern New England. And let's go ahead and take a look at our hazard weather concerns as we go through July. There's that severe thunderstorm and heavy rain risk across the plains into the Mississippi Valley. Particularly over the next 2 to 4 weeks, we'll really be paying close attention to this area. There's a wildfire risk, and this is mainly due to drier than normal soil across that area right now. This is particularly over the next 4 to 6 weeks from Florida up through Georgia, and then even as far north as Kentucky. And then we have that late season winter storm risk across southern Canada over towards the northern Rockies, then even as far west as the northern Sierra there of California. Here's our soil moisture as far as drought conditions. You can see anywhere that yellow shading that represents enhanced risk for some drought conditions, particularly from Kansas over towards the northern deep south. There has been some improvement across this area, but it looks like we'll have a lingering threat as we go into the early part of spring. This is the big change we've seen over the past month or so, particularly across the deep south. Anywhere you see that green shading, that represents improvement of our drought conditions. You see that from the northern deep south over towards the southern plains. In areas in yellow, though, represent the drought is actually expanded. That you can see that from southern Georgia over towards central Florida. And here's our outlook for the drought conditions. You can see continuing from northern Alabama to northern Georgia, and even towards portions of the plains, we have drought conditions persisting. But overall, we're seeing improvement represented by that green shading from the mid-Mississippi Valley over towards the Atlantic seaboard. And so that, Dave, wraps up our presentation for the next 90 days. It looks like it could be quite active across the plains and the Mississippi Valley. Of course, we'll be watching that very closely here as we go forward.
And I know that as the true professional that you are, you described the weather, boom, 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 as it was going to happen. But when I saw the slide that said July and a winter weather outbreak across southern Canada, I kind of went,
wait a minute.
That map says July, and it also says winter weather. So what kind of snowfall are we talking about?
Yeah, actually, portions of the Rockies, particularly the northern Rockies, higher elevations, just to be from particularly Washington State to Montana, it's not out of the question over the next 2 to 4 weeks. They could wind up with several feet of snow. As a matter of fact, in the Denver area, we could see a late season winter storm, particularly late April, early May. So that's looking much more likely.
Interesting. Also, I'll mention that you talked about the counterclockwise circulation around the high and the clockwise around the high and counterclockwise around the low, and where those two areas met, a more enhanced risk of severe weather.
Right.
Coincidentally, that's Tornado Alley.
Correct.
We've seen a lot of weather there over the past years, over the last decades, and we'll continue to do that. I found it very interesting that we're already so much higher as far as tornado count than typical.
That's right, exactly. It looks like that trend's going to continue right through the spring.
Yeah, and the last thing I want to mention before we roll into Chris's presentation is the drought, especially over Southern California. There were a couple of areas in Southern California that were yellow, which I think is exceptionally dry, but they weren't the browns and the reds and the darker colors that indicate an exceptional drought. So definitely some improvement there.
Absolutely, and it has a lot to do with that cold water anomaly that's set up across the Northeast Pacific that's enhanced the Pacific storm track.
With that low pressure out there.
Absolutely, and that has been very beneficial for California as far as getting rid of that drought.
Fantastic.
Yep.
Well, I noticed that our monitor just off to our right is blank, which means we're queued up to roll Chris's presentation.
Great. Let's
and
get
before we
with
do
it.
that, I will apologize, not to you, but to our viewers. I was moving around while Fred was talking and my chair was creaking. So if you heard some bizarre noise, Cameron, our director, looked over at me like, what are you doing? Sorry about that. And sorry to you back home watching our video for all the extraneous noise, but I'll try to sit like a mouse here for the rest of the presentation. So I think we can start Chris's presentation.
Let's get with it.
Cameron, go ahead and pull that up and let's roll Chris.
Hello, I'm StormGeo meteorologist Chris Hebert with the April edition of our 2017 hurricane season outlook. Now, before we get into the outlook, I want to talk a little bit about some historical activity and a little bit about what happened last year. First of all, it's been quite a long period of time the last time a Category 3 or greater hurricane struck the United States coastline. In fact, by the beginning of the season here on June 1st, 11.6 years since the last time a Category 3 or greater hurricane struck the United States. And that was Wilma on October 24th in 2005. So a long period of time, longer than any other period on record, at least since the 1900 period. And looking back toward the 1850s, I haven't found anything longer than this stretch now, nearly 12 years between Category 3 or greater landfalls. Hurricane activity since 1900, this is hurricane activity in blue, and major hurricanes, 3, 4, and 5 hurricanes in the orangish color here. This is since 1900, a 10-year average of United States impact, and we can see as far as hurricane activity, a slow decline in hurricane activity. So we're seeing less hurricane activity over the past 116 seasons, and over the past 10 years in particular, a dramatic drop in hurricane impacts across the United States, not only in hurricanes, but as far as major hurricanes, down to zero now for a 10-year running average of major hurricane impacts across the United States coastline. Is that going to continue this coming season? Well, first of all, let's take a look at what happened last year. Last year was relatively active, an above normal season. We had 15 named storms, 7 hurricanes. 4 of them became major Category 3, 4, and 5 hurricanes. Not a lot of activity in the deep tropics moving into the Caribbean Sea. We had a good deal of activity across the southwestern Atlantic, a number of storms affecting the southeastern U.S., and of course we had Hurricane Matthew, which developed into a Category 5 hurricane down here near the coast of Venezuela, tracked up north past Haiti, Cuba, across the Bahamas, and then grazed the east coast of Florida as a Category 3, but it did not make landfall as a Category 3. Made landfall in the Carolinas as a Category 1 hurricane. We also had Dennis, which moved into the Gulf of Mexico and then tracked up toward the Florida Panhandle as a Category 1 hurricane as well. So we did have a good deal of activity affecting the southeastern U.S. this past season. As far as the energy last year, the accumulated cyclone energy, which is a function of a hurricane or tropical storm's intensity and its duration, such that a major hurricane like Matthew here, this is Matthew in purple, gathered the lion's share of the accumulated cyclone energy points. So Matthew, Gaston, and Nicole gathered about 73% of all the ACE points last year. Normal in a season is about 104. Last year we finished up with 135, so it was an above normal season, not just in terms of numbers, but in terms of the accumulated cyclone energy out there over the basin. Well, let's take a look. Last spring, we were looking at the forecasts from the European model here of La Nina conditions. This is the ensemble members of the European model forecasting from last April, and here water temperatures forecast to drop in the tropical Pacific. All the individual members indicating a dropping of the water temperatures. There was a kind of a spread in here. The actual temperatures here that occurred is this blue dashed line, and we did see a weak La Nina last year, which tends to enhance activity in the Atlantic basin just a little bit. the forecast for this April from the European model is a bit different. We don't see any La Nina here. Water temperatures in the tropical Pacific and the El Nino region are already above normal. The forecast is for temperatures to slowly rise through the rest of the spring and into the summer. And by peak season, we may be looking at a moderate, maybe a weak to moderate El Nino this year. And there is a good deal of uncertainty for forecasting El Nino this far out. There's a great deal of spread from neutral conditions here to all the way to a very strong El Nino. Well, I don't think we're going to see a very strong El Nino. I think at most we might see a moderate El Nino, and we're looking at kind of a weak El Nino as the most likely scenario for this coming season, which might be a slight inhibiting factor. When we have an El Nino in the tropical Pacific, we have warm water here in the tropical Pacific, west of South America and Central America. Tends to cause more activity in this region. The air rises here in the eastern Pacific and then falls and sinks over here into the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico. And that sinking air results in drier conditions, and it's an inhibiting factor. But also when we have an El Nino, particularly a moderate to strong El Nino, we tend to have more strong westerly winds across the upper parts of the atmosphere, tracking across the Caribbean Sea and tropical Atlantic. That's wind shear, when you have the winds aloft moving in one direction and the winds at the surface moving in a different direction. And wind shear is also quite an inhibiting factor as far as tropical storms and hurricanes. And if that El Nino gets up to a moderate level, then we may have increased wind shear across the Caribbean Sea and out into the tropical Atlantic. It doesn't affect the Gulf of Mexico as much when we have a stronger, moderate El Nino. We also look at the forecast for pressure across the tropics. This is the European model's forecast from August through September. Generally higher pressure, much higher pressure out here in the deep tropics between the Caribbean Sea and Africa. And that's been the case for the last 2 or 3 seasons out there. And that's one of the reasons why we haven't had too much activity developing out here in the deep tropics over the past couple of seasons. Now farther west, not as high pressure here in the western Caribbean Sea and just barely above normal pressures here in the Gulf. So I don't think it's going to be as much of an inhibiting factor across the western Caribbean Sea, Gulf of Mexico, or out here north of the deep tropics off the east U.S. coast. Now look over toward the eastern Pacific and in toward the Hawaiian Islands. The Hawaiian Islands are right over in here. The European model is forecasting much lower pressure in the East Pacific. We'd expect that with an El Nino, and that might mean another significantly active season for our folks, our friends over there in the Hawaiian Islands this coming season. Have to watch out for that. The European model also is predicting rainfall or lack thereof across the Caribbean Sea and deep tropics. The brown areas are lower than normal rainfall amounts. When we have lower than normal rainfall amounts, it's because we have higher pressure, we have sinking, drier air, and that reduces the rainfall across the deep tropics here. No effect here really in the western Caribbean Sea up through the Gulf of Mexico or north of Cuba and the Caribbean Sea out here off the southeast U.S. coast. I don't think there'll be any activity or any lacking of activity in those areas this coming season. But also look over here toward the East Pacific and over here toward Hawaii. Those are the Hawaiian Islands right in here. Much above normal precipitation indicates they might be seeing another significant season there over in the Hawaiian Islands. They've been very active there the past couple of years. Finally, the European model predicts where the storms might track, where they're most likely to track and where they're least likely to track. If we look across the Atlantic, we see reduced activity, reduced tracks between the Caribbean Sea and Africa, but near normal conditions from the central Caribbean Sea to the Gulf and off the southeast U.S. coast. And over here toward Hawaii, look at that, increased activity likely over here near the Hawaiian Islands. Water temperatures are important because water temperatures can determine the potential intensity of a hurricane, not so much whether or not they're going to form. We still have below normal water temperatures out here across the eastern Atlantic off the coast of Africa. High pressure is relatively strong, causing some upwelling of cooler water here near Africa. Relatively normal water conditions and water temperatures across the Caribbean, but significantly above normal water temperatures across the western and northern Gulf of Mexico. Didn't have much of a winter across the Gulf of Mexico, across the deep south in general this past season, and that's why the water temperatures are well above normal across the Gulf Coast and off the southeast U.S. coast this year. Doesn't mean we're going to have more storms form in that region, but it means that if something does move into that region, then we could see it higher intensity than we normally would. And one final tool that we want to look at as far as predicting what's going to happen this season is the analog years. And an analog year is when we look back to a previous season and find one that has maybe a similar setup going from La Nina to El Nino, Similar steering patterns, similar setups of high and low pressure across the Atlantic basin. And from that we can determine that, well, maybe this coming season, if it matches what we saw ahead of these analog seasons, it might be somewhat similar. And these are the years that we have determined are most close to what we're seeing right now across the tropics. And my coworker, Fred Schmude, I've been working with Fred nearly 30 years now. He's come up with these years here. And we'll go through some of these seasons and see what happened during these years to get an idea of where they might develop and how many storms might develop. As you can see, it ranges from very active in 1969 with 18 named storms, 12 hurricanes, and 5 major hurricanes, down to 2009, only 9 storms, 3 hurricanes, and 2 of those major hurricanes. The accumulated cyclone energy up to 158 in 1969, but as low as 53 in 2009. So the analog seasons are kind of all over the place and not helping us a great deal in determining the numbers, but in average, if we look at all of them, they're pretty close to a normal hurricane season. About 12, 6, and 2 is normal, 12, 6, and 7, and about 3 is what the analog seasons would suggest. Let's take a look at some of those analog seasons and see what happened. In 1951, well, we had about 14 named storms, a lot of them out here across the southwest Atlantic, but east United States coastline, turning off to the north across the Bahamas, grazing the east coast, but no real impact on the east coast. We did have a couple of hurricanes in the Caribbean. One of them made it all the way across the Yucatan into Mexico, fairly strong storm, but really not much activity across the central and northwestern Gulf. A tropical storm affected southwestern Florida in 51. 53, another relatively active season, about 14 named storms there as well. We did have 3 hurricane impacts in 1953, one of them into the Carolinas here, one into southwest Florida, and a fairly strong storm moved up into the panhandle of Florida. Again, not much activity across the northwestern Gulf of Mexico in this analog season. 1963, 10 years later, a good deal of activity again north of the Caribbean. A couple moved into the Caribbean. Now I'm questioning whether this year will be similar to 63 in that I don't think we're going to see a lot of development here moving through the Caribbean. We might see the development farther west in the Caribbean this year. But if you look toward the Gulf of Mexico, we see that we did have one hurricane and that moved into the upper Texas coast, into the Houston-Galveston area. This is the only analog season, I believe, that indicated any risk to the northwestern Gulf, or suggested any risk to the northwestern Gulf. In 1969, the most active season in any of the analogs. Again, a lot of activity out here north of the Caribbean. No real long-track storms moving into the Caribbean Sea. We did have Category 5 Hurricane Camille that formed in the northwestern Caribbean Sea in August, moved right up here into southeast Louisiana and Mississippi, and that was the strongest hurricane ever to hit that area up until Katrina hit the area. It caused more damage even though it was only Category 3 when it moved ashore in 2005. So very active 1969. Still nothing from central Louisiana westward to Texas in 1969. 2002, I remember a couple of storms from 2002. There was Isidore, which formed here south of Cuba, became a very intense storm, moved into the Yucatan Peninsula, wound around there for a couple of days, and expanded into a very large tropical storm when it tracked northward up into the central Gulf Coast, caused a good deal of flooding across the Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama coastal areas. And we also had Lily that formed in early October, became a Category 4 hurricane in the north central Gulf, weakened to a Category 1 before it moved inland into central Louisiana coast, though. So fairly active across the western Caribbean Sea and Gulf of Mexico. We did have a weak tropical storm affect the Texas coast in 2002. Now finally, 2009, relatively quiet season, very quiet across the Caribbean. No long track storms making it into the Caribbean. One fairly strong hurricane out here in the open ocean that ran into Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. And we did have Hurricane Ida developed in the western Caribbean Sea in November. Very late storm. Moved northward, weakened to a tropical storm, then briefly became a hurricane just off the southeast Louisiana coast, and then weakened to basically a disturbance before it reached the Gulf Coast. So very unusual storm there. Again, no real significant threats from central Louisiana westward. So the analog seasons and the other seasonal predictors are kind of a mixed bag this year. For an active season, we do have very warm water in the western Caribbean, and particularly across the Gulf of Mexico. Some of those analog seasons were quite active, but on the minus side, for an inactive season, we have high pressure, again predicted to be in the tropics, particularly between the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico. Below normal rainfall predicted in the deep tropics, again, might inhibit development from the Caribbean Sea over toward the coast of Africa. And the biggest uncertainty is how strong that El Nino might be this year. If it gets a little stronger, then it might reduce the activity from our forecast just a little bit. And speaking of our forecast, let's take a look at what we're forecasting now. We're looking at a fairly close to normal season, a little bit above normal. 12 named storms, 6 hurricanes, and 3 major or category 3, 4, and 5 hurricanes this coming season. Now, where are they most likely going to affect? Let's take a look here at our map. The blue shaded area here is where we think that there's a reduced risk of impact, and that might well extend all the way up to Puerto Rico in here. But I think that we're not going to see any long-track storms or strong storms moving into the eastern Caribbean because of the sinking in dry air in that region. But I do think that development will occur farther west, and if they do occur farther west, then we're going to see some activity possibly threatening the Gulf or the southeastern U.S. coast. So quiet down here. The most active area, I think, is going to be north of the deep tropic up through this region here, where they'll track either out to sea or perhaps graze the east coast. Now, my co-worker of many decades, Fred Schmude again, we're talking about what's going to be the pattern along the east U.S. coast, and he thinks a low pressure is going to set up along the east coast during the hurricane season. And what that means is the jet stream will be coming in from the southwest over in this region, which could potentially steer storms heading toward the southeastern U.S. to the north before they reach the east coast. So that would be good for you folks along the east coast. Now, I can't guarantee that's going to happen with every storm out there, but in general, the pattern may be one to steer them away from the east U.S. coast. Of course, that doesn't protect you from systems that might be developing down here in the northwestern Caribbean Sea and Gulf of Mexico, because we think that it's going to be relatively favorable in this region. If we can get a strong disturbance in that region, we think that we could be seeing a strong hurricane develop there. Typical tracks from the analog seasons indicate either off to the north and then northeast, perhaps threatening the Florida Panhandle to the peninsula, maybe could cross Florida and then threaten the east U.S. coast from that direction, and possibly developing in the Caribbean and tracking westward into Mexico. Now, we certainly couldn't rule out any impact to Texas this far out, but the analog seasons would suggest that perhaps they might track more toward Mexico, and with the low pressure developing over here, we may have high pressure sitting over the mid-U.S. Continent here, and that could keep systems that move into the Gulf either turning westward into Mexico or just on the eastern side of that high, tracking up toward Florida. So that's what we think is going to happen this year. As far as the names this year, this is the list, same list as 2005 and 2011. We had Dennis retired in 2005. Now that's Don. We had Katrina retired. Now that's Katya. Rita was retired. It's the new name is Rena. And Wilma was retired in 2005. The new name for that storm is going to be Whitney. I don't think we're going to make it all the way down there. More likely somewhere up in this area as far as the name list for this year. Well, that's a look at the forecast for this year. For this April, I'm StormGeo meteorologist Chris Hebert. Thank you for viewing.
Thank you, Chris. That was a great presentation. Fred, I think the key takeaway is mixed signals. On the one hand, we have 1969 with 18 storms, including Hurricane Camille.
Right.
But on the other hand, we've got many seasons that have very low numbers.
And the key to that is going to be the El Nino. If we see that stronger El Nino development, we're going to wind up probably struggling to make 9, 10 storms. But if we see a weaker El Nino, that can actually sometimes aid in hurricane development because it produces what we call ventilation. So it actually clears the atmosphere and produces a favorable environment. So right now we're tending to think close to normal. It's just something we're going to have to monitor very closely.
Keep an eye on.
Yeah, exactly.
And of course it is April. So we still have a month and a half before hurricane season officially begins,
starts.
Even though we have a subtropical system that just
Absolutely. So it's an indication to be on
pay
the
attention.
lookout. Absolutely.
Exactly, pay attention. And with that, we're going to wrap up this video. Thanks so much for joining us. Again, I'm Senior Meteorologist Dave Gorham for StormGeo, alongside Fred Schmude, our Senior Scientist for Long Range Weather Prediction. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.